They stared as she walked down the ramp, her boots hitting the polished marble of the galactic capital with a sound that did not belong in a place so clean, so bright. This was a city of diplomacy and wealth, not of war, not of the dirt she came from. But she walked like she owned gravity itself, like the air should part for her, and it did. Even the guards lined along the landing bay shifted slightly, their weapons idle, but their fingers twitching near the triggers, not because they feared she would strike, but because they sensed that if she did, nothing would stop. Her armor was scratched from battles that had no name. On maps, battles fought in forgotten systems where the screams of the dead echoed in her dreams, and in the silence, between stars, she carried no banners, no crests, no entourage, just her and the weight of every command she ever gave, every loss she ever took. Every planet she left behind, still burning. Civilians in the viewing galleries whispered one called her the War Machine, another said she was just a lucky survivor of the siege of Orna Prime. A third asked if that was really her, the one who held the line on the Crimson Moon alone for 9 hours until reinforcements arrived and found her standing, ankle-deep in alien blood, and surrounded by the wreckage of both enemies and friends, but she heard none of them. Her eyes locked on the golden spire that pierced the sky at the city center. The seat of galactic power, the place she had been summoned to and judged by before even stepping inside. She had read the summons once, then burned it, not out of disrespect, but because she had already made her choice and needed no reminders. Walk from the dock to the palace gates was long designed to make visitors feel small, but she walked it like it was a corridor in a bunker. Each step steady, each breath measured, her face unreadable, but her presence louder than words. Every diplomat, noble and soldier she passed turned to look, not because she was beautiful, not because she was strange, but because she carried something in her eyes that none of them could name, but all of them feared. When she reached the gates, they opened for her, not because she announced herself, but because someone inside knew better than to make her wait, and the guards bowed, not from protocol but from instinct, something primal in their bones that told them this was not a woman to challenge, not a soldier to ignore. Inside, the halls were carved from crystal and starlight, with walls that whispered the history of peace, but her footsteps brought the echo of war, and the silence that followed was not reverent, it was bracing, as if the palace itself knew that something had entered, something that had crawled through fire and emerged without apology. And though she said nothing and carried no weapon, every soul who saw her felt the same thing. She was not here to be honored, she was not here to be heard, she was here because someone had forgotten what fear looked like, and she had come to remind them. The throne room was older than most planets, a cathedral of glass and fire, suspended in orbit around the galactic core, where stars burned brighter and silence pressed heavier. The ceiling stretched into infinity, a dome of shifting constellations, mapped in living light, and the floor beneath her boots shimmered with the recorded histories of every species that had once ruled and then fallen. She stepped forward, not stopping when the heralds announced her name, not slowing when they asked her to kneel, her gaze fixed on the distant figure sitting high above the chamber, a silhouette framed by a sunburst of energy, the Emperor of the Galaxy, the living will of the Unity Council, and the one who had summoned her across 400 light years without offering a reason or a choice. Around her, the chamber filled with movement, flowing robes, gleaming exosuits, fluid forms of sentient species, whose names were hard to pronounce and harder to trust. They whispered in their private tongues, some telepathic, some vocal, but all tinged with amusement or skepticism or thinly veiled contempt. She could feel it all, as if their thoughts pressed against her skin like static, and yet none of them mattered. Not really. To her right floated the Council of Kinkeepers, pale beings wrapped in time threads who had not known war in 1,000 cycles, but who still claimed authority on conflict. To her left stood the voice of the Technarch, a being more machine than life, whose very presence distorted the air with quiet pulses of calculation. Above them all, set the heir to the Blue Suns, the alien prince, who smiled like someone who had already decided she was beneath him. She walked forward, the only sound her boots against the metal of the central dais, every step echoing louder than it should, as if the room wanted her to feel the distance, the power, the separation between her and them. And still she walked, her spine straight, her expression unreadable, her thoughts locked behind eyes that had seen too much and regretted nothing. When she reached the center of the dais, a circle of light formed beneath her feet. The protocol chamber, mapping her body, scanning her memories, displaying fragments into the air above her. Fractured images of war zones, burning cities, a young girl holding a rifle half her size, a woman dragging 3 soldiers through sandstorms on a dying moon, and standing at the edge of a crater watching a fleet burn in orbit. Nobles turned away. Uncomfortable summoned fear, summoned disgust, summoned jealousy, but the emperor remained unmoved and the alien prince leaned forward, resting his chin on his clawed hand, his voice low and venomous as he spoke for the first time. "So this is the human general they speak of," he said, "the one who wins wars by accident and survives battles by hiding behind her debts." Words hung in the air longer than they should, longer than gravity allowed, and somewhere in the distance a drone faltered in its orbit as if the universe itself braced for what would come next. But she said nothing, not yet, because power is not what you say when insulted, power is what you do next, and the chamber would soon learn what she did when pushed. Gasps and murmurs rolled through the hall as the alien prince's words echoed in the high vaulted chamber, the sound of them bouncing from the walls carved with the history of 1,000 worlds. Each image shimmering faintly, as if alive, some faces in the crowd twisted into smirks, their eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of seeing a challenger humbled. Others leaned forward with sharp interest, sensing the shift in the air, as if a current had been disturbed. The scent of ozone lingered from the energy torches that lined the outer circle, casting flickering blue light across the polished marble floor. Her boots clicked against that floor, a sound so small compared to the roars of alien beasts or the clang of ceremonial weapons, but in that silence it carried with the weight of something deliberate. She did not flinch, she did not look away. She stood there, unmoving, like a blade driven into stone. The woven sash at her waist, a deep crimson dyed from the flowers of Earth's last preserved valley, seemed to blaze under the alien light. Her hands remained loose at her sides, but her gaze was steady, fixed on the prince, whose eyes glowed faintly as he basked in the reaction of the court. Around them the dignitaries shifted, the rustle of scaled wings, the hum of respirators, the faint crackle of telepathic exchanges filling the hall with a strange layered noise. She could feel their curiosity like pressure on her skin. The alien prince tilted his head slightly, his golden scales catching the light as if to remind the assembly of his status and power. His smirk deepened as though he had already claimed victory without the need for a contest. His long tail curled lazily behind him in a motion that could have been interpreted as amusement or as a predator toying with prey. He spoke again, in a voice soft but carrying easily to every corner of the chamber, repeating his insult in different words, making sure each syllable was coded with scorn. Some in the assembly chuckled, low and cruel, while others remained expressionless, unwilling to take sides too early. She let the words wash over her without a flicker of reaction. Inside her chest, her heartbeat was slow, steady, unhurried, like the ticking of an ancient clock. She thought of the path that had brought her here, of the silent darkness between the stars, of the endless days confined to a small ship with nothing but her own reflection in the viewing port, and the growing certainty that this moment would come. She thought of the old stories told by her grandmother, of standing before enemies who seemed invincible, and answering not with rage, but with the unshakable presence of one who knows their own worth. In that moment, the murmurs began to fade. The assembly was no longer reacting to his words but to her silence, and the way she seemed rooted in the very floor of the chamber. The alien prince noticed it too, and though his smile remained, something in his eyes flickered just for an instant, as if a shadow had passed over his confidence. The air grew heavier, as if the vast dome above them were pressing down upon the throne room, and every living being inside it. She thought of the treaty she had traveled light years to secure, of the ancient document, written in ink that smelled faintly of cedar, and carried in a sealed case, strapped beneath her seat, during the journey through the black emptiness of space. The signatures of her people, marked with precise strokes, were a promise and a plea, a hope that the old rivalries could be put to rest, and that the small blue world she came from could finally breathe without the shadow of alien fleets drifting in their skies. She remembered the faces of those who had gathered to see her off, the elders with their hands clasped in silent blessing, the children who waved strips of colored cloth that fluttered in the wind of the launch platform. The journey itself had been long and without comfort. The stars had passed like cold fires outside. The viewing panels and the silence between them had been the silence of ages. She had counted the days in the slow turning of the ship's clocks and in the fading of the flowers she had brought from home, one petal at a time, until they were nothing but brittle remnants tucked into the pages of her notes. Every moment of that journey had been weighted with the knowledge that the outcome here in this hall would decide the course of generations. Now standing in the great chamber, beneath banners woven from light and air, she could feel the weight of that responsibility like an invisible mantle upon her shoulders. The voices of the court swirled around her, but none of them seemed to matter except the one that had cut through her like a shard of ice, the voice of the alien prince. His words were meant to pierce the heart, to make her feel small in a place built to remind all visitors of their place in the grand order of the galaxy. Yet, she refused to bend her mind, moved over the details of the treaty, the clauses and the rights, the protections and the compromises. Every line had been shaped with care to ensure balance and survival. She had not come to bargain for scraps, she had come to demand equality and respect. She knew that to accept the insult without response would be to undermine every word written within those pages. It would tell the assembly that the people of Earth could be dismissed as inconsequential and easily broken. She could feel the eyes of her attendants from the far edge of the hall. They stood straight and still, their uniforms crisp, their faces neutral, but their eyes betrayed the tension within. They knew, as she did, that this moment was a turning point, that the insult hurled so publicly could not be ignored. She drew in a slow breath, feeling it expand her chest and steady her hands. Her gaze returned to the prince, and she took one deliberate step forward. The sound of her boots striking the polished floor rang out in the silence, and the assembly instinctively leaned closer, as though sensing that the true battle was about to begin. Instead of shrinking back, she stepped closer until she stood at the foot of the throne, her eyes locked with the gaze of the alien prince. The vast hall seemed to narrow around them, as if every arch and pillar leaned inward to witness what would follow. The scent of alien incense hung thick in the air, the smoke curling upward in silver threads that shimmered in the glow of the floating crystal lights. Above, the murmurs that had been rippling through the assembly began to fade until the silence felt like a living thing, pressing against every ear. The prince did not move. He sat upon the obsidian seat carved with the crests of his lineage, each symbol representing a conquest, a victory, a world claimed under his dominion. His tail curled lazily behind him, yet there was a stillness in his posture that betrayed his attention. He was studying her as though she were an unexpected element in a game. He believed he had already mastered his golden scales, caught the light and reflected it in sharp flashes across the chamber. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying not only through the air, but into the very bones of those who heard it. She began to speak of the storms on Earth that could strip the skin from the land, in a single night of the oceans that had risen in the great floods and swallowed cities, whole of the winter so long and bitter that generations had lived and died without ever seeing the warmth of a true spring. She spoke of the strength it took to survive such trials, and of the resilience of a people who refused to vanish no matter how many times the sky seemed ready to fall. The assembly listened. Some leaned forward, their expressions unreadable, while others sat rigid as if afraid to break the moment. A flicker of recognition crossed the face of one elder in the back row, a being whose crystalline form caught the light in faint rainbows, as though remembering their own people's struggle against annihilation. The words she spoke did not rise in anger but in power. They carried the weight of truth and the rhythm of a tide that could not be stopped. The alien prince did not interrupt, though his eyes shifted slightly, as if calculating the effect of her speech. He rested his chin upon one clawed hand, his tail stilling in the air behind him. She could see that his earlier smirk had faded, replaced by something sharper and less certain. Around them, the air seemed heavier, the banners of light above swaying, as though moved by a wind that no one could feel. She took another step forward, her shadow now stretching onto the base of the throne. The sound of her boot against the marble floor cracked through the silence like the first break in a sheet of ice. The assembly held its breath, and even the distant hum of the great engines that kept the station aloft seemed too quiet, as if the entire throne room were leaning toward the edge of something about to happen. Her voice carried like a war drum as she told the story of how her people had faced skies split with fire, when meteors rained down and the ground shook with the force of 1,000 storms. She spoke of the nights when the air itself froze in their lungs, and yet they endured. She spoke of the wars fought not for conquest but for survival, of the moments when entire cities had stood together, shoulder to shoulder against enemies far stronger than themselves. Each word she spoke was a step forward, not toward the throne alone but toward the heart of every being in the room. The banners of light that floated above seemed to still as the very chamber was listening. The faint glow from the great crystal at the center of the dome cast a pale light across her face, making her eyes seem to burn. The crowd, that had moments before been a restless sea of shifting bodies, was now as still as statues. Every sound had fallen away except for the cadence of her words and the steady rhythm of her boots as she moved toward the foot of the steps that led to the throne. The alien prince watched her closely, his golden eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. It was clear to all that he had expected her to crumble under the weight of his insult, to bow or retreat in the face of his authority. Instead, she stood taller with every word, and the force of her presence seemed to press back against him. His fingers tapped once against the arm of his throne, a small, restless motion that betrayed a mind no longer entirely at ease. The assembly began to shift, not in movement but in allegiance. Some who had entered the hall with their loyalties fixed upon the prince now felt the stirrings of doubt. They saw in her not a fragile creature from a distant, unremarkable world, but a representative of a people who had endured what many could not. The silence was no longer simply the absence of sound, but the gathering of a decision waiting to be made. She paused at the base of the steps, looking up at the prince without a trace of fear. Her hands remained at her sides, but her presence seemed to fill the space between them. She spoke again, not with volume, but with the kind of steady certainty that could cut deeper than any shout. She told him that respect was not a gift to be given at whim, but a truth earned through the trials faced and overcome. She told him that to mock the strength of another was to reveal the weakness of one's own. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended over the throne. The alien prince did not answer immediately, and in that hesitation the balance of power shifted, though neither of them moved. The assembly waited, breathless, as if the next moment might change the fate of more than just two worlds. The hall fell silent as her final words seemed to settle into the very stones beneath their feet. Even the banners woven from light hung motionless, as though the air itself had grown still. The alien prince did not move for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that carried no trace of the mockery from before. His golden eyes reflected the pale glow of the great crystal above them, and in their depths there was now something far more dangerous than open contempt. He rose slowly from the throne, each movement deliberate, the long plates of golden scale along his arms catching the light in a sharp gleam. The sound of his boots against the obsidian steps rang clear in the silence as he descended toward her. His height was imposing, the sweep of his long cloak trailing behind like the shadow of a great predator. The assembly shifted slightly, a ripple of anticipation moving through the gathered rulers and envoys as they watched the two figures close the space between them. When he stopped just a few steps away from her, the air seemed to tighten around them. His voice, when it came, was low but strong enough to reach every corner of the chamber. He asked her if she truly believed that the survival of her people made them equals among the stars. He told her that the galaxy was ruled by those strong enough to take what they desired, and that compassion was merely another word for weakness. His words rolled over the crowd like a slow tide, heavy and cold. She met his gaze without blinking. Her stance did not falter. She replied that strength was not proven by the worlds one could seize, but by the worlds one could protect. She told him that the history of her people was not written in the destruction they had caused, but in the lives they had safeguarded and the hope they had nurtured. She spoke not in challenge but in unshakable truth, and the weight of that truth pressed against the prince as surely as any weapon could. The assembly leaned in, as if each word was a spark, and the space between them a fuse. One ruler, with eyes like molten silver, whispered something to an attendant who immediately began recording, while another creature made entirely of glassy segments shifted and gave a slow nod. The mood in the room was changing, tilting one breath at a time in her favor. The prince studied her in silence for several heartbeats. His claws flexed once at his sides, the only sign of whatever current moved beneath his composed exterior. At last, he spoke again, his tone carrying a note that was neither full of scorn nor entirely free of it. He told her that she had courage, and that courage was rare, but that rare things were often fragile and easily broken. The words hung between them like a challenge, yet also like an invitation, and the chamber waited in the tense stillness for which path she would choose to walk next. The assembly watched with unblinking eyes as the words of the alien prince settled into the air between them. She stood still for a long heartbeat, the tension drawn so tightly that even the faint hum of the energy conduits beneath the floor seemed louder than usual. Her gaze did not waver, and in the depths of her mind she felt the weight of a choice pressing against her like the cold edge of a blade. She could answer with anger and risk shattering the delicate ground she had gained, or she could strike in a way that left no mark yet cut deeper than steel. She took a slow step forward, closing the last distance between them, until the light from the great crystal above fell evenly upon them. Both her voice was calm and steady, but each word was chosen like the placement of stones in the foundation of a fortress. She told him that fragility was not a flaw, but a sign of value, that glass could shatter, but could also catch the light and send it across the darkest room. She said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it, and that those who underestimated such courage often found themselves standing alone, Her words rippled through the chamber, and found their way into the expressions of the onlookers. A pair of envoys from the spiral colonies exchanged glances, their antennae twitching in silent communication. A representative from the frost worlds leaned forward slightly, her pale eyes fixed on the human, with a look that suggested calculation and new possibility. Even the great elder with the crystalline body tilted his head just enough to catch the light, as though weighing her words against the centuries of politics and betrayal he had witnessed. The alien prince did not speak immediately. His tail swayed slowly behind him, and the faintest glint of his fangs showed as he studied her. The silence stretched long enough for the air to feel heavy and warm, as if the station itself were holding its breath at last. He inclined his head just slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement, a gesture that sent another small shock through the gathered assembly. Yet she was not finished. She turned her gaze outward to the ring of rulers and envoys and spoke to them. All she told them that the fate of her people was bound to the fate of the galaxy, that no world could survive forever in isolation, that the storms which had once struck Earth would one day come for all, and that unity was not a sign of weakness, but the only shield against the darkness that waited beyond the stars. Her voice grew stronger with each word, and the stillness of the room deepened as every ear turned toward her. When she finished, there was no applause, no sound at all, only the unbroken silence of those who understood that something had shifted in that chamber. She had not only answered the prince, she had taken the stage from him, and the court now waited to see how he would reclaim it if he could. By the time she stepped down from the dais, the balance of respect had shifted, and every eye in the chamber followed her. As though waiting for the next move, the alien prince remained where he stood at the foot of his throne, his golden scales glinting under the pale crystal light. But there was a stillness in him that had not been there before. It was the stillness of someone calculating the cost of a misstep and the weight of the eyes upon him. She moved slowly across the marble floor, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The banners above stirred faintly in an invisible current, and the scent of incense curled around her like smoke from a fire that had burned low but not gone out. The envoys whispered to their aides in hushed tones, yet none dared speak too loudly for fear of breaking the spell that had fallen over the court. The prince called her name. His voice was steady but carried a subtle edge, as if he were testing the strength of a blade. He told her that she had stood against him in the heart of his own court, and that such defiance was rare and dangerous. He said that danger could be crushed, or it could be honored, and that the choice was his alone. The words were not an admission of defeat, yet they carried the weight of recognition. She turned to face him once more, and in her eyes there was neither triumph nor fear, but something quieter, a certainty that she had claimed what she came for. She told him that honor could not be given, it could only be earned by action, and that the court had witnessed his choice, whether he wished it or not. Her voice was calm without challenge, yet firm enough that the meaning could not be mistaken. The silence that followed was deep enough to make the air feel thick. The prince inclined his head a fraction more than before, and then returned to his throne. He did not speak again. Instead, he gestured to the assembly and declared that the treaty would be reviewed with the consideration due to any equal member of the council. The words were formal, yet their meaning was clear, and they rippled outward through the gathered rulers like the first light of dawn over a dark horizon. She gave a single nod, then turned away, walking toward the great doors at the far end of the hall. Her steps were unhurried, yet they carried the quiet weight of victory behind her. The murmurs began again, louder now, filled with the rustle of shifting alliances and the spark of new calculations. The banners swayed more freely, as if the chamber itself had exhaled. When the doors closed behind her, the echo lingered for a moment in the vaulted space. It was the sound of a human who had come to the heart of the galaxy, faced its scorn, and left, having made the alien prince pay not with blood or ruin, but with something far more lasting, the surrender of his unchallenged pride.